So as I said, this is just a quick overview of the carbon measurement signpost, produced first in 2021 and updated in June this year. So we've got, at the start of the learning signpost, is a bit of background. Some people have a lot of knowledge and experience of working on carbon measurement, and some people have none within the Climate Action Fund projects. So we've got an introduction section which just goes through the background as why we've got carbon measurement, where it's come from, and just very briefly going right back to 1994 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where all the signatories to that were committing to submitting an annual inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions. So, going back 30 years is a long history. And then the things that we have in the UK, we had the Climate Change Act in 2008, which committed, which was a legal commitment to be reducing our emissions relative to the 1990 levels, and then that was updated in 2019 to commit us to at least 100% reduction in carbon emissions against that 1990 baseline. And then internationally, Paris Agreement in 2015, which again, all of the signatories committed to communicating their climate action reductions, and then our legally binding target, which is described as carbon budgets. So if you hear about carbon budgets, they're 5-year period reporting of greenhouse gas emissions within the UK, and every ton of greenhouse gas emitted to 2050 will count. So basically, if we see an increase, which is interesting given the current potential changes that might be happening on some measures, there has to be a corresponding decrease in other areas too. So overall, we're seeing an ongoing reduction in carbon emissions in the UK. And in terms of the measurement and reporting, very early on, there was identified there was a requirement to have an international agreement on carbon measurement, which is where the term carbon dioxide equivalence came from, CO2 equivalence, which is the universal unit of measurement for global warming potential of greenhouse gases. So when you see CO2e, that's the measurement, irrespective of what the greenhouse gas is. That's the equivalent that's actually used. So global warming potential, again, it is a detailed thing. Some may be interested and some not. It describes the relative potency of any particular greenhouse gas, and it's calculated over a 100-year period. So carbon dioxide is, as we said, the gas of reference. So it's given a global warming potential of 1 measured over a 100-year period. And there's a whole range. I think it's is it sulfur hexafluoride is the one that's often used, which is over 23,000 global warming potential, and is often used for insulation for high voltage electricity. But an interesting fact that I picked up a few years ago was also used in the soles of the Nike Air trainers to give bounce, and they're no longer using that. You'll be glad to hear. In the UK, the source of the global warming potential is the carbon conversion factors. This is updated annually, and it's by DESNZ, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. So you can go in and see those. They are, as I said, updated annually and can be used to assess carbon emissions of any given activity. And we'll come on to, in a few minutes, just some examples of different tools and ways of measuring carbon that you may be familiar with or may not, and different projects are taking different approaches to measurement of carbon. But if you're building one from scratch, a carbon measurement tool, then these are things that potentially could be used. And I've just put, because quite often in carbon measurement people hear about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3, so I've just included a reference there. Generally speaking, these are things usually within an organization, so local authorities need to report on an annual basis of their carbon emissions, and they define which of the 3 scopes that they are looking at. So scope 1 are emissions that are owned or controlled by that organization. Scope 2 is about energy, so that's around purchased generation or purchased energy, which is either heat or power. And scope 3 is more on the consumption approach, which is basically everything not included in scope 2, but is in the chain upstream. So if they're purchasing goods and services into their organization, it includes all the emissions associated with that, as well as what happens to those once they've been used and disposed of potentially. So it includes all of those emissions. As I said, normally that's only within an organization that you'd be looking at using those. So there's no need to worry about those too much on a project unless you're just looking at one organization's operations. So we've got within the signpost, there are 4 different approaches that we've highlighted to carbon measurement, and different climate action fund projects, that they're so broad. You're all working on different themes in different areas, on different project activities, so you will have your own requirements for carbon measurement. So what we're trying to do in the signpost is just to give examples of different ways of measuring carbon. At the end of the carbon signpost, there are quite a lot of links. There are links throughout the document, but there are a lot of links which give an assessment, pros and cons of using some of those. The first of the 4 different approaches is area-based carbon measurements. So they can be on a territorial basis, which is all emissions within an area, whether that's from the examples we've given there on transport or agricultural activities or industry, or on a consumption basis, which is a little bit like what I just mentioned on scope 3 emissions, which includes upstream and downstream emissions from residents' consumption of goods and services, irrespective of, as we said, where those emissions themselves occur. So if people are buying goods in from overseas, the emissions would be included within a consumption basis area measurement tool. And we've highlighted what they're useful for. So they are really useful at the outset of a project to inform project priorities, or if you're having a bit of a reboot, it can be really helpful. And it gives the carbon emissions of different sectors and activities within any given area. But because they are across whole areas and multiple sectors or activities, it's unlikely that they will provide results that would show impacts of individual project activity, because the changes as a result of emissions, and I'm being very general, but are likely to be very, very small. So it probably won't, you won't see the change that makes. Examples that we've highlighted here are 2 tools in particular. The impact tool, which was developed by the Centre for Sustainable Energy, that can provide results either on a territorial or consumption basis, and it can do it at if I remember rightly, it's at either a unitary authority, a district council, or a parish area level. And then there's a place-based carbon calculator, which provides results on a consumption basis. So as we said, things that people are buying, purchasing, using, and that's based on the average for a particular area and the area that uses are lower super output areas. So as the government defines, it's an area which is between 1,500 and 3,000 population level. So these are just different tools. They're very straightforward, very simple to use, and the links are all contained within the signpost document. And we've just highlighted one of the projects, climate action funded projects, which was R Street's Chorlton, who used that place-based carbon calculator to help understand their area, Chorlton's carbon emissions, what the average carbon footprint was per person across 2 particular wards in that area, and where the carbon emissions were coming from. And we've, within the signpost, there are results of that, and there's also a presentation. So if that's something you'd like to look at, excuse me, please do have a look at the signpost after today. And I'm just going to move on to the second one. This is probably something that you're very familiar with. There are many, many examples of online carbon calculators, some of them on phones, really easy and simple to use. So in terms of engaging with people, this can be something that's really useful to use. They provide a snapshot of either an individual or a household's carbon footprint. They ask, basically, you input, depending on the tool, you input different information about your travel, goods that you buy, your energy use. So there is information that does need to be inputted. The one thing that we should say is, depending upon what you would like to use something like this for, just have a look into what is measured and how much detail needs to be provided. Some of them ask for a lot of detail, which may put people off if you're looking at this as more of a broader engagement tool, but some are very simple. And you also just need to have a think about doing a before and after. None of the tools that we have looked after enable you to be able to save multiple carbon footprint measures using this. So if you had a community that you're working with and you suggested they use this, there isn't a facility across any that we've come across that don't quote me, there may be some that are coming online, but in order to be able to harvest the data across all of those, there doesn't appear to be a way of doing that. So people would have to say what their individual results were in order for you to be able to use this for project measurement purposes. And what we would suggest, excuse me, if people are pledging or taking specific activities, that they would need to do a carbon measurement before and then one after, and to be able to report on what they've done. And many of the tools do enable people to save their previous carbon footprints. So again, there's so many and there's so much detail. Do have a look at these. We've highlighted 3 there of different examples: the carbon footprint tool, the resurgence carbon calculator, and one and I think Casey, did you say that are you working with WWF as well in your project? So yes. This is a very long-standing tool. So they have a carbon footprint calculator. And what we've done, the National Association of Local Councils did a review of 11 different carbon footprints calculators for individuals or households. The links again are in the learning signpost. So we would again suggest people have a look at that. And we've done an assessment at the end, or just a pros and cons of the different online tools. And we've just got an example here. This is a very long standing, it's not a climate action funded project, but we included it within the signpost of Ashton Hayes, which I think was the first village in England to say it wanted to become a zero carbon community. And they used household carbon footprint calculators to work with people in the local community to understand what their carbon footprints were on a household basis, and then repeated it. And they were able to show because they repeated that, and it did involve people actually visiting the houses and working their way through those calculators with the householders, but were able to demonstrate within, I think, the first 2 years, a 40% reduction in carbon emissions of those taking part. So it can be incredibly powerful, but again, we've put the link in there so you can see what they did at Ashton Hayes. And I'm just moving on to sector-specific carbon measurements, and it may be something that is useful to people working in particular sectors. We've given an example here of the farm carbon calculator. It's a lottery-funded calculator. So this is for farmers, but it can be used for the very large-scale farms, right down to sort of small market garden levels. So there is a lot of guidance on the website. Again, the links are within the signpost. But within the Climate Action Fund programme, there is a project which is Farm Net Zero that uses that toolkit, that farm carbon calculator, to work with farmers to assess their carbon footprint each year over 5 years. And it's quite complex. There's a lot of data that has to be inputted, and but as I said, there is an awful lot of guidance there. And what they have found within running for a couple of years now and using that so far is that they've been able to work closely. We have found in work that we're doing for the Scottish Government and others that farmers trust other farmers. So they've been able to work, the team here working on this project have been able to work closely with the farmers to understand the different elements and practices that have been undertaken on each farm. And then there is a whole programme of farm walks for sharing of information and learning from the farms that are involved. And I think there are 40 farms that they've involved across the project with other farmers. So they're hearing from the horse's mouth about what it entails and what they've done as a result of that in order to reduce their carbon footprints. So it's been incredibly useful. A lot has changed. There's a lot of information both on the Farm Net Zero website and also on the Farm Carbon Calculator website. And those two projects are linked. So it obviously needed a lot of resource to set it up. So it may not be something that is possible unless if it is a specific project activity that you've described within your climate action funded project, but there are examples out there of existing tools if you've got a requirement for something that's quite detailed and sector specific. And then the last one is bespoke carbon footprints. And again, this may be something that some of you have already identified within your project, that something needs to be developed. And it's often something, if there isn't a single carbon toolkit that captures all of the activities that you have within your project, this is something potentially that you could do. And we've got an example here of CSE, the Centre for Sustainable Energy, who worked as part of the Bristol Community Climate Action Programme within the Climate Action Fund project. And we've got an example here where they've done carbon footprints of neighbourhoods. And the example on the right there is of Eastern and Lawrence Hill area. And this was something that they used during their development phase of a predictive carbon assessment. Is if everything that was going to be delivered through the project happened, this is the difference that it would make. So again, the links to this are within the signpost. It's very interesting and very straightforward to be able to follow, but that might be something that you want to do. And I know other climate action funded projects are also developing their own toolkits because of perhaps the breadth and range of different activities that they've got. And then the last thing that I just wanted to say before I stop talking, you've had enough from me, it's just in terms of the process, that whatever approach your project decides to take on measuring carbon is to have a baseline assessment done very early on. So CSE that I just mentioned, that was something that was done in the development phase, so understanding what the baseline was, and then reviewing the results and processes involved and refining those processes if necessary, repeating the measurement at regular intervals. Again, that's something to be determined for each individual project, whatever's appropriate, and also to get feedback from people involved in the project and other stakeholders. And that can be really useful, both for perhaps changing some of the ways and some of the things that you want to measure, but also providing feedback to them on the changes that have been made in carbon terms, to give that feedback loop. So if people are providing information, making sure that they understand, well, what happened to that and what changes have been made to carbon emissions as a result of some of the things that I've done and some of the things that the project's been doing. So I'm going to finish there. I'll stop sharing. And I'll also